Good morning. Good morning, campers. How's it going? Feeling good? Boot camp? Got you running the paces? Well, it's a great honor to be part of this, and I'll be floating around, so I hope I get to meet you more one-on-one, and we can have side conversations and whatnot about and learn about what you're up to. So a lot of network analysis is about that, right? It's about having conversations and just getting your ideas out there and getting a lot of feedback. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about network data collection, and I'll just shamelessly plug this book that I'm writing with Jim and Jeff and Dan. So this hopefully will be seeing the light of day in the next 6 months or so with Cambridge. So today's talk is going to kind of bop around a little bit in terms of some of these chapters, but we're really going to be focusing mostly on reconnecting a little bit with theorizing social structure, and then thinking about how to turn theory into action and how to go about coming up with a good data collection plan, and thinking creatively about data, and then kind of walk through some of the paces with the actual sorts of instruments that are out there that are common. So I'm going to start with a brief recap, I've seen Jim do his 30,000-foot view a few times, and I just love it, and it always inspires me. And I'm going to come back in and just kind of zero in on a couple spots from 30,000 feet. We'll go down to like 10,000 a couple times. And then we'll talk, really it's a lot about examples. That's how work gets done. There's no real data collection. There's just many, many different kinds of data collections. And so mostly I'll be talking through examples today. How to detect social structure, some more examples, an example of that, network questions, more examples, give a little bit about data collection instruments that are common for this type of work, and then sort of the big sort of questions around sampling, network boundaries, and maybe a bit about coping with some of the data limitations. So feel free to interject, raise your hand if you have any sort of clarifications or points that you want to insert. I've taught classes up to 550 students, so to me this sort of feels like we can have a little bit of a seminar here as well. So like to hear your ideas. So the recap here, and I think the big point of social networks is that structure matters. And so we have to know what we mean by structure, and it's worth sort of revisiting this wonderful quote about what social networks is trying to do vis-a-vis other methods, right? Other ways of seeing the social world. So again, for the last 30 years, now 70 years, empirical social research has been dominated by the sample survey. But as usually practiced, the survey is a sociological meat grinder, tearing the individual from the social context and guaranteeing that nobody in the study interacts with anybody else in it. So the point here is that when we try to have random samples, when we try to have get rid of the endogeneity problem, we end up getting rid of maybe some of the most important stuff about social life, right? So oftentimes when you get this question about, well, what about the endogeneity problem? I just say, it's not a problem. It's reality, right? And we're trying to model that. That's the point of social network analysis. So this wonderful view of the high school sexual network, the high school segregation along grade, but also race. Structure matters, right? If you remove the individuals, if you take a random survey and you don't see the structure, you're doing violence to social reality. You're imposing a certain kind of understanding upon the world that is inaccurate, right? And it's done intentionally to try to get at a certain understanding of causality, right? Where we can correctly estimate the coefficient, so we can get a single effect, so we can have the correct identification strategy around a certain variable so that we can mimic an experiment. That's what the survey is all about. It's all about trying to mimic an experiment. But that does violence to reality. So social structure is real, folks. It's real. It's out there. and it's our job to try to render it into data and into useful information, which we can call knowledge. So social networks is all about that pursuit, right? How do we take the interconnectedness of social entities and make that the subject of our efforts? And so we always have to keep that as the motivation for any kind of data collection that we're doing. And really, what we're doing is we're abstracting from that. We can never see the social structure. That's something that we can do collectively through thousands and thousands of efforts that we're going to do, right? We start to see it. We start to have an impression of it. But we can get reflections of it that are more or less accurate, more or less useful, right? We can ask the world of social structure to reflect back something at us, kind of like, sonar and, getting little flash images of the bottom of the sea. What we send out bounces back and we get a flash of something of the social structure. And so we do that with math and we do that with visual images. And that's social network analysis. That's what we do. And so the truth is that in general, the real issue from the get-go is validity. We don't want to insert our own biases. We don't want to screw it up. We want to listen, right? You don't want to have an instrument that sends back a systematically messed up view of the bottom of the sea when you're trying to sail a ship through it, right? It's like, oh, no, we're good. No, you're not good. You introduce bias to it. Now, noise is probably okay. We can handle noise, right? We know how to handle the fuzziness of the image. We can correct for it. If we have an understanding of how wrong we might be, we can handle that, right? So a measurement that has no understanding of how wrong it could be is actually kind of worthless. So we have to start to build into our understanding from the get-go that we're going to be a little wrong all the time when we try to detect structure. So the research goals then are really twofold in social network analysis. We have to have this at the forefront of our mind when we're actually, way before we even go out and think about data. We have to think, what am I doing? What are my goals here? And the goals are really twofold. The first is to just accurately represent social structure. Doing that is powerful. Seeing that image of the high school romantic network is powerful. I've shown that to thousands of students. And they just go, whoa, right? Like, that's crazy. I'm like, it wasn't one weekend, okay? It was, 6 months, but wow, they always hone in on this one node that's got 8 ties. They're like, oh, okay. So there are all kinds of implications from just seeing the social structure. We live in a world that is systematically trying to say it doesn't exist, right? And trying to reduce us to individuals, right? Saying that there is no social collectivity, that there is no social. So just seeing the social can be powerful. It can be political, right? It can actually make a difference just to see it and to see it accurately. It is real. And then the second part, which has been developed more recently and is, always been part of the goal, but, methodologically is more tractable today, is to explain the social structure. Where does social structure come from? And what are its implications? So we can put it on one side of the equation or the other, right? If we think linearly. It's something that's a dependent variable. There are things that go into it. So that's really important. And then it has all of these other kinds of outcomes and consequences, right? So there is this reciprocally causal process. And we can't do all of this in one project, can we? So we have to do it through many different projects, and we have to do it collectively, and that's why it's a wonderful community to be part of, and why it's wonderful to be with people who cross different substantive interests, because social structure matters in so many different substantive areas. So this is why from the get-go, I think you have to have a really kind of clear understanding of like, what am I trying to learn about the world before I ever go out and collect the data? And then you go out and you try to detect structure. And the good news is structure's everywhere, right? We've been saying that for a long time as sociologists, right? It's everywhere. It permeates our lives. It's inside of us. It's outside of us, right? We recreate it. It recreates us. So you might not think, you might think that social network data is a certain kind of data. Like, well, that's network data, right? And as Jim, pointed out that I come from this school of thought that's like, be creative in your data collection strategy, right? Don't just think that you have to do it one way. Social structure exists in our smells, how we smell the world. It's incredible. But we actually, our schemas about the social world, about race and class and gender, are actually reflected in the way that we smell the world and how we perceive sense. So I can see social structure through having people smell things. In this case, I'm having them smell things that are really ambiguous. And so they project their schemas onto these things. So think about something like even a conversation. This is from a past note in a high school. So from Meg and Laura. Meg says, do you know Stephen Johansson? A lot of people think he's a geek, I guess. But he likes me, and he's so nice. We talk on the phone a lot, and I went over to his house last night. Nothing happened, but he's really nice, and his family is nice, and he has a huge house and a pool. Asshole joke. His sister is pretty. She doesn't look 12 and a half. She looks like she should be in 9th grade. A lot of people told me not to worry about what other people think. I asked him to twerp the woman is required to pay dance, kind of. I still have to figure out what's happening. I don't know what we do or where we go or who with. You're probably thinking I'm crazy to go with Stephen. I hope you don't think he's a big nerd, because I know he's not super popular or anything, but not a lot of people really know him. And once you get to know him, he's super nice anyway. Better go, right? And then the note comes back from Laura. I know Stephen pretty well. He's a great guy. I think it would be awesome if you two went to twerp. He's just shy, not a big nerd. Sarah, his sister, is really pretty, and we play tennis together. It's a network. It's a network. Meg is trying to work out some anxieties about social structure, right? That's her worry. The note is all about just like, there are intransitivities in my social structural world, and how do you feel about all of this stuff? And I'm not sure about the structure, right? It's a call out to the world to help me figure out things structurally. So Meg's view is I'm unsure about Laura. Is she pretty? And she doesn't look 12 and a half. And right? She's pretty, but uncertain about how Laura feels. Right? So this is Meg's view. Meg is uncertain about Laura's feelings about Stephen. Is he a geek? She's uncertain about Stephen. So there's all of this. She gets a response from Laura, which starts to seal up these intransitivities. It's like, what do you think about it? It's positive, positive, positive. So all of these things start to add up into a view that says, oh, cool, I can go to twerp with Stephen, right? So we're doing this all the time. We're doing this all the time in our speech. We're doing this all the time in our interactions. The documents that we create, the worlds that we create, how we interact with each other. The structure is with us. We are the structure. I am one with the structure, and the structure is with us. I'm one with the structure. The structure is with us. And we recreate it. So the point here is when we're collecting data, from the minute we collect the data, we're already doing theory. We already have a theory of structure before we actually go out and get the data. Yeah? That we are looking for a certain thing. And I've just really agonized about this talk because there is no way to give you data collection, right? I can try to give you a philosophy of data collection, some of the tools, and then the places to look to figure it out and to make sure that you didn't, to make sure that you're getting back what you want from it, okay? It takes substantive knowledge of the phenomenon. if you know nothing about high schools, if you know nothing about note passing, if you know nothing about dances, you know nothing about the social world of adolescent society, something like that is just a mysterious document. I mean, it's certainly something that comes out of a Western kind of environment in which going to dances and things like this means something. So you need to know the meanings behind these relations. So bring your substantive game there. There are inherent trade-offs in all approaches. Of course, we would like to have as much data as possible on as much of the social world as possible, but we don't have infinite time and we don't have infinite resources. So in general, if you can collect more data at a more fine-grained level, that's better. Longitudinal better is in general better. Longitudinal data is in general better than just cross-sectional data. You can always aggregate up. You can't break it back down, right? So if you have a choice, right, then try to get stuff that's more detailed. But of course, that may come with other costs. So there's an inherent, in all social research, there's an inherent trade-off between the depth at which you can collect data on each of your cases, on each of your nodes, on each of the things that you want to know about, and how many you can collect on, right? So that's why we end up with qualitative case studies, comparative analyses, and then more large-scale kinds of approaches. So in my own work, I actually am tortured about this, and I oftentimes I try to do a little too much on these fronts. And for a lot of the work that I've done, I've actually sacrificed a little bit of the breadth for more depth. I'd rather have a little bit more knowledge about the individuals and have smaller groups than have a larger view of the social world. Jim, in his work, and many network analysts, would make the other trade-off more often. And I've done that too, where you say, look, you want to see the structure, right? You need to have more ties. It doesn't matter, if you have a really deep understanding of the meanings in each person's head. As long as you have more and more ties, you're going to be pretty well off. So ultimately, no data is going to be perfect, but the real point is to not mess it up and not introduce bias into the data through the collection procedure that you engage in. All right, so data collection is already theory. There is a reality out there, and the reality is the social structure. It is real, right? We turn that reality into data. We ask something of that. We send a signal out into the social structure. Structure, show me something, right? As soon as we do that, it's like Heisenberg's uncertainty. You force it. You force it to take on a certain kind of thing, right? That's theoretical. Then you process that into some form of information, largely through these mathematical and visual abstractions. That is the core of social network analysis. And hopefully from that, you produce some useful understanding of the world, some knowledge of the world. You could do this at many different levels and many different frameworks. This is a high school classroom. If you were to just ask for social structure in little 1-minute increments in a classroom, you wouldn't see much, right? There's not much structure there if you just look at 1-minute slices. You have to aggregate up to maybe more like 5-minute slices. You start to see more structure, right? That the kinds of interactions, right, that are happening between these are teachers, the teacher assistant, and the students, and their interactions, right? You need how they're speaking with each other, right? You need to have something along the order of a larger level of aggregation to even be able to start to see the structure, right? But if you gather data at this level, you can always aggregate it up to here, right? Again, but there are trade-offs. So so everything involves kind of a theory of social structure, and there have been lots of efforts to try to have a unified theory of social structure, and all of them take a while to ponder. And my favorite is by Hind, who was an anthropologist. It was an ethologist, primates. He was actually Jane Goodall's dissertation advisor, right? We think it was Louis Leakey. Leakey just got Goodall into the business and said, "Here, my friend, please advise this person." So Hind was a primate ethologist. This is really an abstraction about social structure among primates, of which we are included, right? So what goes for chimpanzees and maybe more bonobos in our case, it goes for us, right? So this will be posted. You can hunt this down, but I think that this shows, I think, a ponderable kind of way of thinking through social structure at many different levels. That there's an interactional level, right? So if we look here, we see students in a classroom talking with each other, right? We just see bodies moving, people talking, activities together. These aggregate up into relationships, that you start to see that over time, right? You start to see more of these relationships over time, and then you can infer, oh, hey, Craig and Jim are friends, right? Oh, they're colleagues. There's something going on there, right? And then from there, you can aggregate up to levels of groups, social groups. Oh, there are different kinds of interactions that make up these groups. There are, that's a teacher, that's a teacher's assistant, those are students, right? And that these are guided by these more abstract levels of schemas, ways of understanding the world, ways of abstracting it. So in many ways, the social structure exists in an idealized, schematic, psychological in our brains, right? But we enact it through interactions, right? Interactions then compound and compile into relations. Relations compile into groups, and groups form larger kinds of institutions, right? Something like the university at the very largest level, we can think of the university as an institution. An institution is really shaping all of this, right? This only makes sense, and we only do this because we know because of the university sort of guides these processes. So I don't want to get too philosophical, but so there are many different ways of gathering data. Some of the most common that we'll talk a little bit more about, bless you, small group questionnaires, large scale surveys. Less common, more the stuff that I do is a little less common, but maybe becoming more face-to-face observations. We're having a lot of sensor data that's coming in that's starting to really be able to detect when people are facing each other for more than 20 seconds and then click, something like that. Oh, hey, that's an interaction. There are obviously lots of ways that structure has moved virtual, right? And we can scrape websites, use APIs and digital archives. So archival data is becoming increasingly common. It's easy, it's cheap to use, but there are lots and lots of issues with using this kind of data. I think that for many of us, those issues are worth it because floating your own survey is costly. Trying to go out and collect observational data takes time and is fraught with certain kinds of ethical and IRB issues. So it's actually been very difficult for me to get approval for this project, where we're just filming preschoolers in the classroom, like doing an ethology of their interactions is proving difficult. And so some of the issues are things about the construct validity. So when you scrape lots of things from the internet, are you really getting real social things, right? Jim talked a little bit about Facebook stuff, and tons of people want to study Facebook, but like how many of your friends are your friends? Which ones matter is a difficult issue. So people have oftentimes, if they want to actually build a construct validity into that friend concept, they have to then go outside of Facebook and limit it to, oh, well, they're all in the same high school together anyway, right? So then they just are looking at a high school network as it is expressed on Facebook. So I've been involved in work looking at co-authorship networks, the sociology of science and collaboration, multidisciplinarity. And from this, it's like there are all kinds of traces of that. You know, writing, every time you write a grant with someone, right, it goes to a certain office. Maybe that office will share data with somebody, right? You know, we know how much you know, somebody asked, how much they got in a grant. So you can, it's great data, but you know, there are lots of issues. Probably the most serious one here has to do with what we call disambiguation, identity disambiguation. How do I know that this is the D. Wong who's in chemistry and not the D. Wong who's in physics, or the 3 D. Wongs who are in computer science, right? Or, you know, there are so many, you know, it often uses the same initials and things like that. So there has to be a whole set of other processes for trying to connect up the right agents, the right nodes. And if you're really messing it up, right, you will end up completely inserting bias into the world. It will look like D. Wong has 1,000 publications is the most, you know, this is the biggest polymath who ever existed because it's in chemistry and physics and computer science, and you know, and in the business school, as my friend Dan Wong is at Columbia. So it's like all of these different. So you're introducing bias into it. So you have to be very mindful of all of these issues. So each sort of strategy, each way that you're going, social structure, reveal yourself, right, is also an opportunity for you to, like, you know, do something really, really dumb, or something very subtly dumb, or, you know, or just, you know, you need to make sure that you're not, like, making it wrong. So observational data, I'll talk about a little bit. I'm a big fan of this because in many ways, what could be more valid than that kid took that kid's toy, right? That's an interaction. That's down at that level of, you know, the interactional order of the social structure. So that's the most fine, in many ways, that's like the most fine-grained data that you can get. Streaming interactions, conversations, face-to-face, right? I come from a kind of school on the West Coast, sociology. They talk about conversation analysis, ethnomethodology, like really getting into the moment, like what is happening? How are we socially constructing reality? Like right now, right here, like now, right? And if you can get that, then that's great. So audiovisual stuff, you know, having ways of filming, assessing. This is getting better, right? And so it's not cheap. So, you know, they want a lot for the equipment for some of this stuff, but some of it is getting more approachable. Like I said, the sensor Wi-Fi data. Of course, there are technical challenges to these things as well. You know, you also have to do a lot of manual coding still of this stuff, or transcribing of it. I'll talk a little bit more about that with an example. So the point is it's a huge investment of your resources, your energy, your time, and it needs to be thought through in terms of, are you going to be able to get the sort of images and the kind of data that answer the sorts of questions that you want to answer before you even go out. So I'm a big fan of just talking about these things all the time with people, trying to find sources of data that are out there. And in many ways, if you can find a source that's already there, you know, that may be, you know, you could spend so much time trying to plan a data collection process, but if you just talk to people, you might have found out that there's something that's really usable that's already out there, right? So be creative. In other words, you know, there's no single right way to collect the data. There are all of these different kinds of strategic trade-offs that you're going to have to get into. You have to have a theory about the world and substantive interests and knowledge. It's just social research, after all, in the end of the day. social network analysis has the exact same trade-offs. So let's get some examples. So I want to take us back to a very early example. Maybe it might be in some ways the first real study of a small group informal social structure. And that is with the Hawthorne plant in good old Cicero, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, and Roethlisberger and Dickson, and their analysis of the networks that formed at the Hawthorne plant. Actually, fascinating history connected with social networks here and sociology in general that if you we can talk about it at some point. So clearly, the idea here was that these scientific managers, these Taylorists, right, these Fordists kind of went into this plant doing their kind of the work that they do, careful industrial social psychology, and trying to see, well, how can we increase productivity, right? Let's increase the productivity at this this bank wiring room. They weren't wiring banks; they were wiring phone banks, right? And I think this was part of the Bell Corporation at that point. So that's why it says the bank wiring room, right? So you had to stand in a place, and it was a manual task, and this is really in some ways when social networks started to be formulated as a seeing of reality that others had missed. So clearly, a single room in a plant is not a complete network of the plant, and it's not a network of these people's families, right? They had lots of ties outside of it. And as we'll talk about later, when we think about boundary issues and defining your networks, it's theory. It's theory that helps you, right? There's no place that it ever stops. The social structure just keeps going and going. It's theory that gives you a reason and a substance to stop collecting data at a certain place. And so I think that kind of definition and knowing what you want and what you're looking for is part of the data collection strategy. It's what are you asking? You already have a theory of social structure before you even go in. So in this case, there's reason, there's warrant to just study this one room. There's warrant for it because these people work in the same room every day together for a long time. And the outcome of interest has to do with work productivity. And so Roethlisberger and Dickson went in and as part of this team, and they made a fascinating discovery. They discovered that people at work form relationships with each other. And that was something that they hadn't really, puzzled through as scientific managers before that, and that would impact certain productivity. So in writing up their findings, they started, in many ways, the kind of core activities of social network analysis, which starts with theory, starts with an understanding of what you want to see from the social structure. And in fact, well, they discovered it inductively, really. So this is, you had soldering units, you had inspection units, you have a map of where the wiring room was. This is the observation room showing the wireman's positions. So there's a physical space. Oftentimes, physical space matters, right? If you really want to understand how people interact, it's like, what is the actual lived I've been told not to say lived experiences because that's redundant. What are the actual experiences of people in these environments that they have? So collecting a certain amount of data on the individuals, whether they were a wirer or a solderer, their age, their birthplace, nationality, marital status, education. So this is a certain data structure that's familiar to us all, right? This is essentially, a regular kind of data file. We will call this like, an attribute file. So that's the one kind of data set that we keep. And then the other kind, right, is something about the networks that form. So here are the positions of the wirers and the solderers and the inspectors in this this wiring room. And here we see participation in games, right? Hey, wow, so who plays with whom, right? That's pretty cool. And you can see that this is heavily structured spatially. This is the nodes' positions here. This is a visual representation. So we already have learned something. Boom, like that. People who are in close proximity with one another play together, right? We learned something. And this is just circles and lines, right? This isn't actually, this is an abstraction. This is a visual abstraction of what's going on. The lines here represent a joint activity, so they're not directed. It's not like I play with you, and we play together, right? So you see the lines are symmetric. So we learned something. Cool, interesting. Poor W5, and W6. This is not where you want to be, right? You do not want to be there in the middle. We all know this, right? We know this. This is not the place. And it's not like there's something about their personalities. This is by just fate, of where they were positioned. Life sucks. Participation in job trading. Oh yeah, so you trade jobs with each other. So again, we're getting at this sort of interactional level here. Participation in helping, who helps whom. And then we can start to layer these on. So this is the other point, is that social structure is multi-layered, right? It is reflected in all kinds of relations and ways of talking and ways of interacting. It's everywhere. You can't gather it all up, but they've done a really good job. And you can see that when you start to layer these onto each other, it basically, you can kind of build up to that relational level. And then what do we call it? Oh, they're friends. They're friends. And maybe we could have just asked, who are your friends, right? But we could do that too. The point is that those things, may or may not go together so well, right? Sometimes people have a habit of thinking they're friends with people that they're not friends with, or there are asymmetries in friendships, or you just kind of forget that you interact with or play with someone, right? And that these things are inflected by all kinds of other aspects of the social structure and our unconscious biases and things like that. So here we see positive relations. Now there was the controversy of the windows. It's Chicago. Windows are very controversial, especially in the 1930s, right? It gets hot in that factory. It gets cold in that factory. How do you deal with the windows, right? So who participated in this controversy? You can see the interactions there. And you can see how this layers on with antagonisms, right? So, the fundamental feature of social life is that we have positive and negative ties. Right? It's not so easy to get people to admit to their negative ties. Maybe you need to, gauge this in multiple ways. I've studied cults and communes, and it turns out in communes and cults, people don't like each other. They really don't. It's not one big happy love fest in a lot of these places. There are a lot of antagonisms that emerge, but they don't. It's really hard to get them to admit it. But if you ask them lots and lots of questions, you can then start to infer. It's like, oh, they didn't say that they loved them. There's no love, maybe. So you can think of this as like the two, and then so from here you can see that there were actually really kind of two groups that emerged. We're moving up, right? Interactions, relations, groups, right? Here the groups that emerged were really about these different positions in the physical space, right? And this on W6, right, in the middle here, right, on W5, and it's not good. And so what they did was they followed productivity. How did this affect the workers' productivity? So again, observing some outcome. What is the, you're supposed to be working. It's a factory, right? How much output are you doing, right? And so they recorded all of this. So we're kind of coming to the other part of the equation. So we're seeing like the things that come together. The etiology of the network has a lot to do with space, right? Has a lot to do with how that then fomented conflict over the controversy of the windows, right? Who interacts and plays games with whom, right? It forms this underlying reality of an emergent social structure that then became a thing. But then there's the outcomes, right? Then we say the network structure then goes and actually causes things in the world. And in this case, it had a lot to do with how hard you worked and how you didn't necessarily want to work harder than the people in your group, right? It called that, rate busting, rate busters. It's like, you're really messing up this tenure thing for me, publishing all of that. It's like, come on, can you just, settle it down? And so it turns out that there was a very strong correlation with the mean output and the group that you belong to. And not only that, there was an amount of day work allowance claims, like when they wanted to claim a larger amount of, was it for sick time or something like that. You can see that these things were really heavily clustered in the groups. This group was much more productive. And then if you see the difference between how much they reported that they worked and how much they actually worked, it turned out that these groups were much more accurate. This one was overinflating how much they worked, right? They were asking for a lot more day work allowances. And this person, W6, actually worked this line. The ones who are kind of here on the edges, it's kind of like they almost like purposefully or something, maybe just underreport. They underreport how much they're working, right? This person is betwixt and between these two cliques, one more productive and one less productive. So they're actually being more productive than they're admitting that they're being, right? So, okay. So I think that's an example, right? Questions, this is a small network, right? Maybe that's all you need. I like small networks. I like having many small networks, right? Let's get 30 groups of a size like that. If I was to do this, I would look at all of the different rooms, right? And try to compare them, try to think about the different morphologies and the different outcomes, get something at a higher level of analysis. And one thing that you just can't, overlook when you think about something like this is ethics too. So you're going to have a lot more about ethics, right? I think you're going to discuss it, but clearly being observed by a bunch of white men from Harvard in suits and ties might have a little bit of an effect on your productivity, and there's lots of things to consider even before you go out into the field. And obviously we have IRBs for a reason, and even though it can be frustrating, there's something like this study of the bank wiring room is highly sensitive. We see this information could really seriously impact these people's lives. And so there are lots of ways that I think, from the outset to consider that not only when you're, that social structure is real, but it's really powerful too. And it can have a lot of issues. So the point is that there, to kind of come back a little bit to what Jim was presenting, the big picture, there are different types of network questions. So sort of knowing at least roughly where you stand in terms of what you're looking for is important. And it's sociology, so it's a 2x2 table. Everything's a 2x2 table, which is great, makes a lot of sense. You can, I'm sure you'll get a lot more of this as the week goes on, but really there are those who are more connectionist in their views about networks. What they really want to understand is what flows through networks, right? So a lot of times, maybe the vision there is that you're trying to think about important resources or things, right? Things you want or things you don't want that flow through these ties. And then the more positional approach is a little bit more at that higher level of abstraction in terms of thinking about how social structures are comprised of different roles. The roles are generally afforded by their institutional context. So we're here, there are students, there are professors, there are administrators, right? And those people may not all know each other. I mean, certainly we don't, but we have equivalent positions vis-a-vis the institution, right? We have the same labels that are applied to us. Not all uncles hang out with each other. It's like, oh, you're an uncle. I'm an uncle too. Hey, awesome. But within the family structures, uncle is a thing. Now, in other kinship structures, mom's brother and dad's brother, not the same word, not the same position, right? Different. So the positional approach is a little bit more abstract. It has a little bit more to do with schemas and ways of thinking and organizing. Most people, and I think rightly, it's about diffusion, it's about influence, it's about, the morphology of social structure in terms of its capacity to really, influence and spread certain things rapidly or slowly, right? We're in the health sector here, so it's obvious like, wow, small worlds are really conductive, right? That things can kind of jump across from one click to a farther one away like that. So small worlds, social capital, peer influence. If we're thinking about the other side of the equation, right? We're not thinking about the networks as the cause, but the networks as the outcome, the real dependent variable. There are all kinds of ways of getting our head around that, like what drives the network together. So with the bank wiring room, we saw that space was more important than being Polish, right? It had more to do with your location in physical space. Positional, when you're thinking of networks as a cause, like there's some really amazing work that suggests that, that once one takes on a certain role, it induces behavior in oneself, right? That having power maybe corrupts people in some ways. Having certain popularity maybe actually generates this kind of sense of confidence, and that makes you, actually a little better, or at least you think you're better, right? Which could matter for a lot of things. So networks can also, as roles, can also be the result of things. So what drives this? And hopefully you'll get a little bit more looking at these different high school structures, right? And a lot of the work that Jim has done is really fascinating stuff about the underlying sort of morphologies that there are different kinds of ways, different ingredients that go together in these different high schools that you can see that they tend to have a variant of different kinds of structures, of hierarchies and different kinds of positions. And that's something that's impacted by a lot of other things, like in the environment. So, how do networks form? There are lots of theories around this. You'll get more of it, but I just, thinking about these processes, it's like is going to point you to the certain kind of data that you need to gather. If you're really interested in how networks form, then you're probably going to be in a position where you need to be gathering a good amount of attribute data that are on certain exogenous factors. That is, we could think about the space proximity as an exogenous factor, racial, gender, having certain kinds of activities. So in a high school, you probably want to think about all the different clubs and activities. So this is where you have to have all this substantive interests and knowledge about what is the thing that you're looking at. Like, what would you get? You can't gather data on everything, so you need to use theory, prior research, right, that has demonstrated the kinds of factors that are involved. So homophily is one of the core findings of sociology in general and social network analysis, that birds of a feather flock together, that when there are relevant dimensions of social structure that are made salient, that that those things matter. They're socially constructed, but they matter, and then they matter in bringing people together. And then there are certain endogenous factors within the network itself, right? That there are underlying kinds of rules and shorthand and ways, so that we saw in that note passing thing that it was like, I'm not sure I want to make a connection with Steve, but then Laura says it's cool, right? And so that's a kind of like, oh, well, you say it's cool, so then if you think Steve's cool, then that's good. That's like the friend of a friend is a friend. That's transitive closure. That's a kind of underlying endogenous way that networks tend to elaborate. So whatever might bring the network together in terms of its initial state, there's a churning out of structure that happens. There's an underlying set of ways that these things get elaborated. And a lot of my work has been in this area of balance theory and trying to think about the underlying, there's a kind of a neurological foundation to some of these things that we just kind of feel like that's wrong or we feel that that's right. So you have to think about, from the very get-go, it's like, what is the node? What is the tie, right? So you'll get much more of this, but just trying to, off the bat, be like, okay, because that's going to make the biggest impact. Is like, are you interested in individuals, groups, organizations, communities, nations? You can collect data at all of these different levels. The ego, dyad, triad, cliques, try to get a whole structure. So as soon as you engage, and this is why I'm saying you should talk to people, right? You should think this through. People will give you feedback on this. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's the kind of data. Networks happen in the space-time continuum. So at what level are you gathering this data? Are you gathering it at the level of minutes in a classroom? Are you gathering it over hours, years? It's fascinating, but a lot of these processes kind of play out at various levels. And that's one of the things that I've been working with. I've studied book clubs and these book clubs all interpreting the same novel and how they talk and they make sense of the novel and form these influence networks. And in the course of 45 minutes to 2 hours of heavy drinking, they come to understand something that they didn't have any real understanding of before. And then I've looked at these communes over the course of a year, and I find almost the same kinds of processes. So there's, you can see that if the time scale of these things. And so, so there's certain underlying rules that oftentimes are generalizable rules for how network structures form and are elaborated. So Jim didn't really, I think, tell the part of this story that I always the image itself, right, is just compelling. We learned something, right? But the image is also begging for some explanation, like what is going on with this necklace? Or should I say sex? No, sorry, no, sexless, I don't know, sex. So this necklace, there's some pun in there to be had. Why does it have this chains, right? Why is it chaining like that, right? We learned something, but it calls forth a set of questions, like what on earth would generate a structure like that? Well, it turns out if you break down the network into its components, into its dyads and triads and four cycles, you find that there's a kind of four cycle that just doesn't happen nearly as often as it should by random chance. So even though this isn't longitudinal, right, you can infer a lot by just breaking it down. And it turns out that what happens is that this four cycle doesn't happen, and it happens, and it doesn't happen in such a way that it reveals a kind of underlying feeling of ooginess that arises from the social structure. The social structure gives us feelings, and in this case, it doesn't give us a good feeling. And then we don't want to have that bad feeling, so we avoid the structure that gives us that bad feeling. And that structure that gives us that bad feeling is when you date the ex of your ex's current partner. Ew. That's yucky. Although you probably are perfect for each other, right? You have so much in common, so much to talk about, so much to hate on, right? Like, did you see Jen? Oh, Joe, right? But this is so the rule of romantic leftovers appears. So if you play out if you play this out over many, many iterations, and people are just like, ew, 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 right? Then That's what helps. That's what helps to explain the network, right? So you need to be able to have a substantive interest to even interpret something like this. How would we know what that meant if we didn't know something about how relationships form? And it's cultural. It's socially constructed. There's nothing inherently ooh about it. It's just ooh in the context of our modal high school. So again, you have to think about what are the kinds of things that you want to gather data on. Is it co-location, similarities, relations, interactions, flows? My advice to you is if it's possible to get it at a level of less aggregation, that you should go for it. There's lots of qualitative studies, that emerge from looking at how people interact and relate with one another, and I've engaged in some of those. So relating is a network process. It's a dynamic process. This has been done largely from more qualitative studies of symbolic interactionism and ethnomethodology, conversation analysis. But I'm one of those people, part of a group of network people who's trying to go in there with more formalization, more falsifiability, trying to think about these things dynamically. And then there's a very important issue of tie strength, right? Tie strength. So we saw how having multiple sorts of relations, collecting data on multiple relations, you can start to build up, to a relationship and to a relationship of a certain strength. So considering how to measure tie strength is something that you also is often a really important part of the data strategy. So people have ties of a given strength. Some people are friends, some people are good friends, some people are best friends. So how do you end up getting that kind of data? Here's an example of a study. Another example, this is about trying to think of emergent structure from interactions. Where do initial romantic bonds come from? When do people click with each other? It's a dyad, right? So it's sacrificing a lot in this case. So there's not much structure that's really being examined in the study. There's a huge trade-off in not being able to think about the endogenous kinds of mechanisms. A lot of us meet our partners through friends of friends, and back in my day, we all went to potlucks, and you got invited to a potluck through a weak tie. That was perfect, Oh, I'm going to meet new people, right? So here we sacrifice all of that structure to just look at the interaction, to just look at the dyadic interaction. So we studied speed dates, and in this case, it was like trying to get into all of that detailed, deep information about what happens when people first interact with one another in a romantic encounter like this. They wore sashes that had microphones, it had recorders on them. All of the, but then it's a huge data effort because all of that has to be transcribed. Some of them would be like muffled and stuff, right? So there's a lot of cleaning of this that had to happen. That cost somebody quite a bit of money to do out of their grants. So we had, as in most speed dates, the men would rotate from table to table. They'd have 4 minutes to try to impress, or certainly not mess it up too much. These were recorded. Here's maybe this will work. This is an example of this sort of thing. Nope. I don't think it's going to work. We don't have sound? It's so much more fun. Oh, okay. Well, we'll just do that then. We'll just have the pinwheel of death. But you can see, these kinds of. This is a detailed sort of interaction. We gathered all. Now it's just completely messed up. All right. Oh, yeah. Oh my. Oh no. I think we just get rid of that. Try it all over again. Okay. Good morning, campers. How you doing? Life good? All right. Let's. We won't make that mistake again. So you can see that, mainly they're not talking about anything. It's like they're trying to find something in common. They're taking turns. There's a kind of a racy moment in here where she says, "Yeah, I like to do anything. Like I'm up for anything." And he says, "Really?" And she just shuts him down and says, "Yeah," meaning not what you think, buddy. And then he retracts. "Oh, are you open-minded about most everything?" "Not everything, but lots of." "Well, what's not everything?" "I don't know. Think of something and I'll say if I do it or not." "Okay, I'm skydiving. I wouldn't do skydiving." "Yeah, I'm afraid of heights." "Yeah, me too." "Are you afraid of heights?" "Yeah." So what is going on in this interaction is that this gets thrown out a lot. We would just say, "Well, were you attracted to this person? Did you like this person?" We just ask them that. Well, it turns out that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. And if you just ask people, would you see this person again? And did you think that you clicked? For women, those things are highly correlated. For men, they're not very correlated. They're like, "I don't think we clicked, but yeah, I definitely see that person again." So we recorded these, transcribed them. So again, this is the kind of trade-offs that are involved. When we recorded them, we created these things called prot scripts, which are ways of doing like intonation, right? So really trying to get down to the level of, like I always thought of it a little bit like a dance, like a little, like the bird that's like doing a little, like just kind of get down to this level of these sounds. And then we did these dyadic models. So when does a tie form? Like what is a tie formation process? What does it look like? And these actor-partner interaction models are pretty awesome. They can model all kinds of things. Like, so there are things that the person does that makes them think that they clicked with you. Like, in other words, like, "Yeah, it was great. We really clicked." But it turns out that like maybe that's just because like you were talking loud. Like me talking loud makes me think that we clicked, right? But me talking loud makes you think that you're talking really loud and you're scaring me, right? Or maybe like me talking about my work, right? "And then I published my third article," and I'm like, "I was great. It was really great," right? So, but then there are things that then really do the clicking. And so there's, and this varies by gender. So women and men in this interaction have different kinds of ways of relating and clicking. Okay, so I want to inspire you to think creatively about networks, to think about data, to not be like driven into thinking that there's just one kind of network project. There are trade-offs that are involved. So Jim talked a bit about this yesterday as well, that oftentimes we think that this is the only way of doing network analysis is to have a full social network. And then we think of egocentric networks where we like pull out individual A and individual B and just look at their one-step or two-step environment around that ego as being kind of a proxy, a way of trying to get at the social structure. And I think that this is a really good way of thinking about how there are different levels, and your question can be targeted at various levels. So here, we were looking at the speed date study. We were really looking at the kind of best friend. Hopefully, my wife's my best friend, and it's like the best friend level. How do you form a best friend? How does that tie emerge? We removed all of the other structure from this, but we're able to make that sacrifice because we got so much depth on this, and we saw that in the moment that there are these interactional sequences and ways of relating that matter. Ego networks, are great for certain kinds of questions, and the wonderful thing is you can incorporate that into a survey, right? So you can have a random survey and have all the strengths of a random survey, and yet you can also start to build structure into that, right? So you can then ask, oh, hey, you're not going to get the complete network, but for many questions that are out there, you don't need the complete network, right? So don't feel bullied that you don't have a complete network. If your question is not complete is reliant on a complete network. Some studies, like the Roethlisberger and Dickson, they really were just focusing on a kind of a click, or 2 clicks in one room, right? That's all they were interested in. So for me, that's been a lot of what I've been interested in, is kind of fateful groups that help define themselves in what we call a more realist approach. You can get more removed from the network, and then ultimately you can get a global network that encompasses even isolated dyads and just isolates. So this is just a little bit of review. So, and the 1 and 2 mode network. So the other thing is that 2 mode network, and it really bears sort of emphasizing that 2 mode network is oftentimes, a lot easier to get. It's a lot easier to know that, Jim and Peter co-authored a paper together than to know that they were, out surfing together a year ago in Hawaii. You didn't know that? I don't know. Just kidding. So, you don't necessarily, you can infer lots of relations through these 2 mode networks. So looking at 2 mode networks and affiliations is often a way of having a certain higher level of relating. You know that there was interaction and fateful interaction that was going on, but you're kind of inferring it through a jointly constructed project, or being in the same sorts of groups. Obviously, smaller groups are more important in this regard. So in studying collaboration networks, obviously there are some collaborations in the sciences where it's like 500 people, write a paper. I don't think that they were all, writing it together, right? Or interacting with one another in a very fateful way. So there are ways that you can start to take the team size into account and think, okay, well, the smaller the group, the more the repeat interactions, then we can start to build up from that. We can start to infer something of an interactional order, something of a strength of tie, something at that level. So the other lesson is just because you don't have the perfect data for the thing that you want to ask of the social structure, it does not mean that you cannot find data that is a strong and largely, hopefully, unbiased, maybe noisy, but hopefully not biased kind of way of getting that information from the world. Ultimately, we've talked a little bit about these cognitive networks, and for some people, this is the kind of the ultimate of data in network collection, because it's not just interpersonal ties, but it's everyone's perceptions of everybody else's ties that you gather. And so you end up with a very intensive data collection process, but then you can ask certain kinds of questions of cognitive data, network data, that you just can't ask of other kinds of data. It's who has the most accurate perception of a network, right? You have the objective sort of the more objective network in which people report their actual friendships, let's say, but then they've also reported all of their perceived understandings of all the friendships that are existing within that world. And so it turns out that's also very important for validating certain kinds of informants, like an outsider, an isolate. So this has been validated, right? Is like isolates don't have very good perceptions of the network. Maybe that's why they're isolates. Maybe it's a kind of reciprocally causal process, right? Like people who have a better sort of facility with social structure, who kind of very quickly are able to understand, like, oh, well, they're clearly dating. Oh God, well, those people hate each other. Can't you tell? People who are able to do that are able to be more facile and work their way into network positions. And so those are probably the people that, if you start with those people, you're going to get a more accurate kind of perception of the network. And we wouldn't know that without actually having collected cognitive network data. So the point is ask yourself questions about your networks from the get-go, the kinds of things that you're asking of the social structure, what you want. Is there data out there that already exists that can answer these questions? Or are you going to have to collect the data yourself? Secondary data sources, that what are the different pitfalls that are there, whether or not you want to, if you have to have one mode data or if two mode data will do. And then there are all kinds of instruments that are out in the world that are readily employable. The most common is these name generator surveys. This is the most common in terms of gathering egocentric networks. So you put this into a survey, and but you can also do this in more complete networks as well. You ask people to list the number of friends. If you oftentimes people say like up to 5, but then the thing is people will answer the questions that you give them, so you can introduce biases into this process by, if you give them a roster, a full list of the class from a school, they might over-report their friendships. They might imagine friendships. Oh, yeah, me and Steve, we're really good friends. Steve's, who's that? If you ask people to recall them, then that, in a free response, then that can lead to under-reporting. You just might not, and it could also be biased in some ways. So these are the kinds of things that are practical matters, right? Practical matters that I think you should invest some time in once you've really kind of gotten your act together about the questions, the trade-offs that you're willing to make, and then going out and gathering these sorts of instruments and thinking about which ones will work best for you. So for Jim, again, it's more likely to sacrifice the depth for the breadth, and I think for a lot of people who are health scholars that will also be the case. That the outcome that's of interest is some health outcome, so that's pretty well known in some ways. Do you smoke? How much do you smoke? Certain kinds of issues of life expectancy, morbidity, etc. So then what you really want is you want to gather more data more broadly. So there's a little bit of things about bias. The main question that you see over and over again on the GSS and others is this one question. From time to time, most people discuss important matters with other people. Looking back over the last 6 months, who are the people with whom you discussed matters important to you? Just tell me their first names or initials. So there's consistency of this across surveys. Yes? Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Forgive me for running through these pretty fast. I was noticing that that it's time is precious here, but yes, I will absolutely. I will share the slides with everyone. Like a lot of people, I was kind of doing last-minute adjustments to these. The main point here is that this stuff is well known. There are modules that can be implemented readily. There's a lot of literature about the kinds of advantages of some of these, the disadvantages of some of these, and so I think that once you look into it and you do your due diligence, these things will become clearer. Whether or not this kind of instrument will work. But it looks something like this, where you, where in an online or in a electronic sort of format, you would enter names into this, and up to contact 8 here. Again, there's a whole literature around how many of these things and what are the trade-offs there. If you ask for a certain number, some people will give you even more if you give them space, right? Like if you actually gave them a written survey and you ask for 5, they'll give you 8, And things like that happen. So once you're, it deals with sort of the quality of the relationship. So once you've sort of listed the contacts, then okay, well, who is Lisa to you, right? So then you're starting to get things. We know that there's been something of, discussing important matters, perhaps, but who is this person? Your parent, your child, etc. What's their Who are they? We want to know something about their race, maybe. So these are things that are very important. If you're interested in social capital and immigrant enclaves, and like, are people who are socially isolated who come to this country, are they only interacting with people from their home country? Are they getting more broadly integrated? What are the consequences for that in terms of like where they decide to send their kids to school, or their health behaviors, or understanding of their choices, things like that? You're going to want to get that kind of information, right? You're going to build that into the instrument, and then if you're going to try to get something of structure more than just the degree, right? How many ties people have to certain places, right? That you need to see how those people are interconnected, or the perception of those people from the ego standpoint, and whether they're interconnected. So this is where you start to build up those one-step ties. So okay, well, are Lisa and so-and-so friends, right? Are they, what is their relationship? So you start to get the perception of the ties from the standpoint of ego there. So one of the most important issues that you'll all face, and I've been kind of dancing around, but I want to kind of zero in on here for a minute, is this issue of the boundary specification, right? That the social structure just keeps going. It just keeps going and going. So we have to put some kind of closure on it. And I said before that theory is your friend, right? Theory and substance are your friends. That's what's going to allow you to justify your sample, as in all social research, right? So, if you're going to be trying to collect a more complete data set around a set of individuals, right? Then you can either give them some kind of survey, you can observe them, there's some roster of names that you've collected, but maybe you missed an important person on that roster. That would be a terrible blunder, right? Missing a key actor will bias the structure that comes back to you. So you have to be very cautious about that, and you need to hopefully have a good, list of names, a good generated maybe through snowball methods, etc. So this is kind of a form that looks at friendship nominations, where you list your friends and how long you've been friends, and a number of characteristics, and what settings do you usually see this friend? What do you do? So this is the way that I really learned what network data was. Like in graduate school, like to me, this was when you learn social network analysis, like you get this. You give everybody one of these, and they fill it out, and you end up getting back everybody's sort of perception of who their friends are, their relationships with them, and how often they interact, whether they seek advice, etc. You could ask for dating histories, families. There's all kinds of ways of churning out these kinds of lists, these rosters, to try to collect this data. And it's now you can do it through more electronic, and so we'll download it into a CSV file for you right away. But so when you're sampling, when you're really, everything is a sample, right? It's just how do you go about sampling it? You could be like the Roethlisberger and Dickson, or me with book clubs, and me with other things. I lean heavily on sort of like, well, they all live together. They're in the same academic department together, right? So that's a pretty good boundary definition. There can be event-based. There, like the Smoker's Island, right? It's like, we kind of had Smoker's Cage in my high school. It was like really sad. It was full of kitty litter and like in a little dungeon. So avoid that place. Relational approaches are like, trying to trace things out, having a respondent-driven sampling technique. There are trade-offs in these things. So Granovetter says start with a fixed set, see who's connected with whom, and then at some point you start to get a kind of a network saturation. You start to get the same responses. You start to see like the edges of the network start to kind of appear as you start to get a redundancy in the nominations that form. So a network exists in people's heads, it exists in their interactions, it exists in time a lot of times. And so the real division here is often between more realist approaches and more nominalist approaches. A realist approach really says, well, because the networks exist in people's heads, you just ask people, right? It's like, who's in your group? It's not that hard, right? It's like, who's in your family? We got it, right? Who's in your classroom? So you can get people to elicit the lists. And then there's a more nominalist approach, which is oftentimes, something that's convenient and maybe is important theoretically, because maybe the thing that you're interested in is something that people will be systematically missing certain parts of the network if you just ask them, right? They will forget certain kinds of relations or certain kinds of interactions that they have that you think are theoretically and substantively important to the project and the question that you're trying to answer. In which case, you need to define, you need to name nominalist, you need to name it and impose a conceptual framework on it, a 2x2 table. So this can be more static or it could be more temporal, right? Static realist approaches would, maybe you're asking in a classroom, in a school, who are your friends? Yes, ma'am.
If you want me to wait.
No, it's fine. No.
It's fine. Yeah. So I do work, like social networks is relatively new to me. I do work in like team process, team performance, and in healthcare teams.
Yeah.
And they are expected by the organization to function as a team. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes they're assigned to teams, but they don't behave like teams.
I know.
Is there like a...
I teach students, and they do projects together.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if there's like a comparative or like a combination of these approaches.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, I think that what you're pointing to is exactly my point. It's like you have a substantive interest. You have a theoretical interest. Teamwork, right? What makes a good team? What makes a bad team? It's something that it's an underlying fundamental structural question. Does it have something to do with the sort of skills that people bring? Is it something endogenous? Is there just like some kind of way that things get going? Free rider problems, all of this stuff, right? So how do we get people to be more pro-social in teams, right? So that's a very, very a priori way to think. Like I'm looking at teams, right? And I've defined the boundary as these teams that were supposed to work together in a certain way, right? And then I ask within those teams, their relations, their interactions, or maybe I observe them, right? Or maybe I look at the outcomes of their work, right? So I think this is the reason why there's no one way to do this. It's your question.
So I was wondering if there's a way, because they're being told they're a team, you ask them to say they're a team, but then the way that they're behaving, and sometimes their interclass correlations and everything are basically saying, I don't see this as an actual team.
Yeah, that's all.
To highlight the gap, is there a way to do that?
Is there a way to collect data on that and to?
Well, I guess to kind of analytically show, like, you say this, you think this, you're behaving this way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. In other words, you observe. In some ways, the Roethlisberger and Dickson is your friend, right? They're supposed to all be working. They're in the same room. They're supposed to be producing. It really just divided into two groups, right? And then you ask them their friendships, the controversy of the windows. You look at their productivity outcomes, right? You look at the group that's supposed to be a group, and it's not a group, right? This is a fundamental sociological issue, right? A commune is supposed to be a community, right? Not two, right? It's like, and you find things like that. It's not supposed to. So this is the exact right terrain for thinking about, well, what kind of data would I need to address that? Well, you would need to know people's outcomes and their perceptions, but then you would also need to know what they were assigned, how they were assigned to work together, right? Yeah. The main point here, a 2x2 table. You can think about the main approach is that you don't have to just take a realist or a nominalist approach, right? You can combine these things in some way. I think that is the larger point that comes out of your question. That these things will be very dependent on the specifics of your questions and will emerge from that. You can, but that in general, a project tends to fall somewhere within these kinds of spaces, right? That you tend to think about the network. When does the network happen, right? Is it something that the students in the Smokers Island, it's like, well, there's the fourth period network at Smokers Island. That's totally different than the second period network at Smokers Island, right? That's just so the place is the same, but the time is totally different, right? That could be a real issue. You could, obviously, I think having a nominalist approach, having a realist approach embedded in a nominalist approach, in many ways, is going to give you a different kind of data, right? And it's in no way they're no way mutually exclusive, right? You can engage in these at the same time. And different studies tend to focus on different things. These are some of the classic studies and that you could follow up on that are more realist, looking at high schools, the bank wiring room here, right? And a number of other studies. So ultimately, I'll close with just a very brief thing with, you're not going to get data that you're always super happy with, that you're going to have to ask yourself, once you have that data, am I happy with this data? Is this good data? Is this data making us smarter about social structure? Or is it introducing systematic errors into our understanding and not helping at all? That involves all of the regular kinds of things about reliability, accuracy, recall, precision, and a number of other things. But the ultimate thing is that it's good news. It's social research, and it's no different than any other kind of social research. So I'm around this week, and there are cool things like this that I'll post. That this. You can do some posterior tests of robustness and sensitivity to some of these things that Jim and Jeff have put up there. But that ultimately, be creative in your thinking about networks. It's, I think, a real creative process, and data and structure is everywhere. Just listen to it, and it will reveal its secrets. Okay, thank you.
Questions, comments from Craig, data collection.
Yeah. This might be a little bit. So when you do the data collection of most of the social networks, can you talk a bit more about the IRE process relating to that? Because I know we covered a little bit, but especially focusing on the web streaming and the data collection.
Can you, I just couldn't quite hear the last part. So
can you tell me more about the IRE process when you collect network data, especially using web streaming?
The IRB process for that. I'm not a real expert on this, but Jim probably has some good thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think the main thing is to always get IRB first. And one of the amazing things that I'll often work with some folks in health informatics, which are usually pretty good, but even worse are just computer scientists in general, who say, I can go scrape anything you want. And there are the two main things to keep in mind when you scrap away web data is that sometimes the data are legal and public, and you can, like, they're there, you can think you can have them, but there's a terms of service that they expect you to have read. And so if you read the terms of service and it says this data is not for use other than you reading it on the web page, then even though you can collect it with a super simple script, you can't have it, and your IRB will say no. Now, oftentimes you can email the web administrator and say, hey, do you really care if I have this data to see how you can make money on it? You go, no, then fine, help yourself. But that's the kind of thing you got to do ahead of time to make sure that's possible. For the most part, the IRBs have been very generous with us collecting data that's already public, right? So web scraping is usually not much of an IRB problem, so much as it is an intellectual property problem. And that's an issue that's more about the corporate governance of that organization that's running it. Now, it gets a little bit dicey if you're dealing with things like Reddit, where the question is whether or not these things are really public or not, once you've aggregated them up, but by and large, most IRBs are pretty good. I want to echo what Craig said, which is that the theme that's going to run through this whole week is that if you're used to taking your stats class, your methods class, where they say this is how you specify a model, and if you don't put this little parameter at the end, you screwed it up and you're wrong, and your analysis are all wrong, and you're going to die, and you're going to take and all the rest of this, right? That's not what network analysis is. Right? Network analysis is a set of, we are sending you a toolbox. We're not telling you, giving you instructions for how to build a cabinet. And so these set of tools, right, you can use in lots of different ways, and we hope you become brilliant, beautiful sculptors and doing like this cover-worthy, furniture making. But you're not gonna like do horribly wrong if you follow some pretty basic data collection rules, and you use the opportunities here to think that what I want to do is think about how my theory of the social or health process maps on data, and you put those things together with some of these tools we have, and you're going to win. And so we don't want you to be too constrained into thinking that I got to use the GSS because everyone else uses the GSS. If the GSS question doesn't work for you, use something else.
I have a question about the epistemological issues. So just mentioned your previous work, collaborative work with conversation analysis and ethical methodologists. So how would you solve the epistemological dispute between constructionist epistemology and positivism? So like, can network analysis inform constructionist work or even critical research?
Yeah, for sure. I don't see it as an epistemological conundrum, except that Garfinkel was really, really cranky guy and wrote like gibberish. And but I actually think that that I don't see it. I actually don't see a real epistemological issue between sort of interpretivism and sort of a more positivist theory testing approach. I see them as different moments in the research process in which we are trying to understand the same thing in the world, and we're using different sorts of tools to do it, right? And so I really enjoy and read and learn and benefit a lot from more qualitative interpretive case studies. I actually really kind of like that's the stuff I really get excited about reading, but I don't want to do that kind of work, right? But I like talking to those people. So like Gary Allen Fine, when I was at Northwestern for 3 years, it's like a buddy, we hang out, we talk. He talks about studies like idioculture. He studies like, every study that Gary does is just like, he studies like mushroom collectors and D&D people and like weather people and people getting their masters. And he was a student of Goffman's back in the day. I totally see the world the same as Gary, like, except for me, it's like, I want to actually, build into it falsifiability, And so instead of spending a year hanging out with this group of little league baseball people, right? I'll gather data on interactions and relations and understandings and meanings among many, many different groups over different time periods. And then using the tools of social network analysis, social psychology, and other approaches, I can show like, well, when do people start to like influence the way they see the world, right? And when do they come to a shared understanding, and when do they not? When do things fall apart, right? and fragment. So I see us all doing stuff on group dynamics, right? Intragroup, intergroup dynamics, identities, meanings. I think that social network analysis provides a formal set of tools for looking at the social structure and like the meaning structure. So you can, I didn't even get into this because, you know, mostly people are more health stuff, but it's about meanings too. And you can use network analysis to look at understanding.
So network analysis should be purely objective, or can we use network analysis?
I don't believe in pure objectivity. I believe that we're stuck in our world where we can only ask, hey, structure, you know, tell me something about it, and ping. And we either do that by observing it and interpreting it, or we actually use certain more formal tools to get at it.
But it varies depending on the kind of network, right? So HIV doesn't care if you believe it or not.
That's true. That is not socially constructive.
My question's about fatigue when you're doing name generator surveys. So
Yeah.
I'm working with some egocentric network data, and we did ask on 3 different occasions. So we do have longitudinal data, but I watched as I was present for many of the surveys, and I could see that both the interviewers and the respondents were getting fatigued by the questions. And even when we came back 4 months later, you're like, oh God, you're asking me these things again, you know? So I'm just wondering how to handle some of that in terms of how that impacts your data, and also maybe even in future data collection, how to mitigate that as much as possible.
So that's a great question. And now I just think in general that we've asked people way too many things now, and this makes it really hard to do, right? So I think reflecting on that and understanding that there's just people are overburdened a lot, and certain populations are terribly overburdened with being studied, and so I think building into that all the regular sorts of mechanisms for getting people more enrolled and following up and things like that is even more important in network analysis, because if you start to lose the structure that way. So I mean, that's just kind of like I empathize. I think in general it doesn't so much bias. I don't feel like fatigue necessarily biases our view. It just makes it fuzzier. It makes it less fine-grained. I think the real issue has more to do with if we're doing things that make people systematically overlook certain kinds of relations, certain kinds of nodes, and that those are key to our understanding of a certain kind of process. Jim, do you have other?
I think that this is where you have the luxury and time to pretest your instrument as much as you can, and as much as there's nothing like the most expensive part of every study is getting in the field and getting in front of the person. And so all of our instinct is ask another question as long as I can have it in front of me. But the honest truth is never ask somebody something you don't need to ask them. It's that if you can if you can link data to administrative records. Like in high school, you should never ask people the stuff that's already collected by the administrators. Because why? Except for the kids that are bored and they're study hall and they'd rather take your survey than listen to the teach. But most of the time, you're not so lucky with that option. So the key rule is never ask anything you don't need the answer to, even though it's so tempting to ask for more information. And the other thing is, if you can do anything in your design to pick up where this fatigue happens, that helps. So for example, we were at DNAC has a seminar every week, and a few months ago we had a speaker come in, and he showed a remarkable decrease in activity over time as people were engaged in this process. But he had recruited people at different processes in the social system, in their social life in this project. And so there was no behavioral phenomenological reason for them to be decreasing in their time over the calendar period that they did, except for the fact that they all took the survey at time 1, realized it's a long, boring-ass survey, and at time 2, they filled out fewer theses, right? So a better design would have been to interleave the waves, right? So you would have one cohort start here, go 6 months, and the next one go and start. And so you have a fresh one at the same time that this one is taking the second one, then you know that difference is probably due to fatigue, not due to the peaks, right? And so what to do about that, if you know where the fatigue is coming from, you can model it. And there are modeling. There's always a trade-off in this work, right, between whether you believe your data or believe a model. And that's another epistemological question. But in some sense, models can complement the data in a way that we correct this stuff. And speaking of models, we do need to get to the next session and give people a quick break. So get up, use the restroom, go forward.